My guest today is Harini Nagendra, who is a professor of sustainability at Azim Premji University, Bangalore. She's a prolific writer of scientific papers and the author of two books, Nature in the City, Bengaluru in the Past, Present and Future, and Cities and Canopies. Welcome to the Wild Women Interviews, Harini.
Thanks, Janaki. It's a pleasure to be here.
Who are your favorite writers?
Okay, so that's a long list, but if I have to think of the people that strike me the most, I'd say Robin Hobb. I don't know if you've heard of her, but she writes fantasy, very well known in the fantasy circles. But she writes this large sweep of books which are essentially about the world learning to coexist with dragons, and the dragons are really a metaphor for coexisting with nature whose bounds are beyond us. And it's a lot of it in the background. You don't get it in the story. It's very sort of really in the background, but is about how you can't control nature. We would like to control nature, but nature has a mind of her own and does her own things, and we're just there incidentally. So yeah, there's a big arc of, I think, probably 14 books dealing with that entire sphere. So definitely Robin Hobb. As a child, I would have to say James Herriot, because just the whole relationship with animals and the fact that you could dip into these books at random, pick something, pick it, and just so those I have to say those two.
Who do you admire the most?
Without a doubt, it would have to be Eleanor Ostrom, who work on the Commons was so influential. She was at that time the first and then the only woman economist for a long time to have won the Nobel Prize till last year. But I worked with her for several years, and I'd admire her for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think she came to the field of public policy. She didn't really do economics per se, though she got a Nobel Prize in economics. But public policy, which is a fairly quantitative field in the US, at a time when women were not supposed to do these kinds of things. In fact, she wanted to do economics and wasn't allowed to take the prerequisite maths course because she was told that women would waste a seat because they would end up barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen. Right? So she worked at a time like this. When her husband moved to Indiana University, she moved with him and got a job. She had a PhD from LA, groundbreaking work on water management. And she moved with him to LA as a stenographer for Indiana University because she couldn't get a faculty position. She got one during the Vietnam War because so many people wanted to escape being drafted and came and enrolled. So enrollment went up, they needed more faculty. She got sort of the job now, which is the 8 a.m. morning slot to teach a bunch of undergrad kids. And she converted that work into another groundbreaking piece of work on cities and municipal governance. So just the sort of the never say die spirit, the energy of the person, but also the warmth. I think she's the only person that I mean, the world of science as I do, and the world of, how do I put it, experts and expertise. And often you find that people who are experts in their field may not be very nice people because somewhere that expertise gets to their head, or I don't know what it is. The structure set it up in such a way. So she's one of the few people that I know who was a giant in her field and the warmest, kindest, nicest person that I know. So I have true admiration for that, I think. And just the spirit of always turning your lemons into lemonade.
Wonderful. So, what would you have become if you weren't studying ecology?
Yeah, you just asked me this just before this. I was thinking, honestly, a writer and somebody who studied English literature but also did writing, but of a very different kind, I'd say, probably fiction writing. So you probably don't know this, but on the side, this is a long-standing project of mine. I used to write a lot of fiction when I was a kid, and I haven't for a long time. But I just wrote a detective fiction set in 1920s Bangalore, which has been taken on in a 3-book deal. So I'll have more announcements to share with people in like a week or so. But yes, this would have been my alternate career, and I'm happy that I can somehow, it just took me 13 years to get back to doing this, but I'm happy that I can still work it in with my sort of other day job. I would have been a writer, yes, one way or the other.
It actually shows because your books are so readable. I couldn't tell it's written by an expert, it's not dry. It's just very engaging. So I'm looking forward to your fiction now.
Thanks.
When I first met you, you were studying forests using satellite images. What can you learn by looking at forests like that by looking over maps?
you can learn so much. So when I came in as a very accidental user of remote sensing, and I started doing this in 1993 when the use of computers for studying satellite images and studying landscapes in India was just in the infancy. So I'd say I'm one of the sort of the earliest users of digital, what we call digital remote sensing in India. The way it came about was completely by accident. I went to this landscape called Siddhapura. There's a small town called Siddhapura in Sirsi. There are a number of Siddhapuras in Karnataka, but this is Sirsi Siddhapura, which is a mosaic. It's got part forest landscape, part areca plantations, part extremely intensively used agriculture. So just a complete mix of from intensive agriculture to something that is semi-forest, semi-agriculture, all the way to forest, right? And I was very interested in landscapes and landscape ecology. And I think we've discussed this before, but I really did come to ecology through the sort of the normal route of being a bird watcher or someone interested in nature. What I've always been interested in is patterns and how you can determine process from patterns. Why does this pattern happen in nature in this place and a different pattern what you see in another place, right? So I wanted to map the landscape in Siddhapura. What do these maps tell us? These gives us really a synoptic view of a landscape, right? What's above. And that helps you understand things like, let's say you have one remaining wild patch of forest. Now, is it remaining and protected because nobody could get to it? Maybe it was in a high mountain, or maybe it's in a very marshy area, so it wasn't the right place for people to develop. And if that's true, that means that there's a bias in the way we have located our protected areas. They're all going to be in marshy places, or they're all going to be in high mountains, or they're all going to be in some kind of inaccessible places. And therefore, for instance, maybe the mangrove forests, there's very few protected areas in mangrove forests because they are so much sought after for conversion to shrimp farming or paddy fields, or things like that. Is it that so you miss certain kinds of wildlife because certain kinds of protected areas just are high market value, so they don't stay protected? Those kinds of things you can see with a satellite image because you get that large landscape view. The other thing you can see is, for instance, let's say somebody protects a forest. Often there's a bias. That forest looks, if you're only studying that forest, maybe after you implement a ban on, let's say, tree felling or grazing, that forest regenerates over time. But the people haven't disappeared and their need for that landscape or those products haven't disappeared. So what do? They go outside the forest and they hunt twice as much or they graze twice as much. So what you've done is you just displaced the treasure and you made the outside areas more degraded. Now that displacement, whether it's occurring or not, again, you can track through a satellite, right? Through this landscape view. Whereas if you're in a forest, you only know what's happening to that place. And the third thing you don't know, of course, is how do these forests interact with each other? How does an elephant move between patches or a tiger or a butterfly move between patches? So for me, opening, landscape views or landscape ecology, which you can only do through satellites because you have this large picture, is really opening your eyes to a very different way of studying forests.
Great. But now you work within a city. So
right.
What led to this change in location and even the way you do research now?
So that happened completely by chance. So I moved back. I was out of Bangalore for some years. I worked at Indiana University 2000 to 2003, then moved back. And in 2005, we moved to the periphery of Bangalore. What was then the periphery? An area in Sarjapur Road, and built a house and moved there. And I found there that there was this very different kind of landscape. It was peri-urban. There was what seemed like a beautiful lake, but it was a garbage dump. There was a beautiful patch of lotus, some dragonflies, but the rest of it was, a dead carcass of a pig, some borewell on the side. It looked really bad. And I tried to building the house, we had a garden. I tried to get plants for me that were indicative of old Bangalore. What my mother has in her garden, what my aunts had in their garden, certain kinds of, mallige, jasmine species, or so you go to nurseries and a lot of them turned me away saying, nobody asks for these anymore. We are supplying IT companies with palms. So I don't want palms. But so then I started thinking about the ecology of the city. At the same time, a couple of other things happened. I became a mother, so I had my daughter, and I was thinking of what kind of a city will she grow up in? Because the Bangalore I grew up in was pretty green. You could really interact with trees at least. That's the one part of nature that I really like. Very little in Sarjapur is a concrete jungle. There was nothing else around. And then I started thinking about the number of trees that were being felled in the city. So there were a huge number of trees being felled for road development, and there were Hasiru, Usuru, and a number of development groups protesting this. So I started participating in this with no idea of doing research on the city. Started participating in it as a sort of a citizen of the city, a parent, a resident. And then it turned out that we needed some maps of these lakes to negotiate with the BBMP, saying, this is an interconnected system. This lake is not dead. You need to landscape, you restore it in an ecological fashion. So I did that. Or the activist groups were looking for some independent data set of the numbers of trees and the diversity, because government estimates for trees were always an underestimate. They did really funny things. Any small tree was a sapling, so it didn't count. Any large tree was over that it's a banyan of 60 years and it can survive another 100 years. But they don't count it because they say it's over mature and going to die. So their estimates of trees to be felled are always like 30% of the actual estimates of trees that are going to be. So we did independent estimates. None of this I expected would become research of my own or published papers, but it took a life of its own, and it went from one thing to another. And now the urban research I find it far more satisfying, frankly, because I'm embedded here and I feel like all the research we can do contributes to action in some way, or awareness in some way, in a way I simply couldn't do with my forest research.
Okay, so nature and city don't go together for most people. Like if you ask them what is nature, they'll point to some place far outside a city, maybe to a forest, to a tea plantation. But you've written a book called Nature in the City. So what is nature to you? How would you define nature?
To me, nature could be anything. I mean, it could be a snow leopard in a completely pristine landscape by herself, or it could be a butterfly in your apartment garden on a pot. I think it's any element that makes us engage with life that is not human, or makes us understand that there is a life beyond the human creation. And it comes back to my dragons and Robin Hobinson's. It's a life that we must have to depend on, but it's also life that we can't control. I think that's the thing. In the city, we are so used to controlling everything, to being in charge of, you see a rocky plain, you blast it and you build an apartment. You see a marsh, you drain it, build an apartment. But you can't control nature to be all that way. So the rock would also be nature to me. The marsh would also be nature. And you see that, because if you build on a rock and there's a time of drought, you're not going to get water. Or you build on a marsh and come the rains, you're going to get flooded. Your basement is going to get flooded. The first 3 floors of the apartment are going to get flooded. So I think it's very important to understand you need to think of nature in the city. And for me, it's multiple reasons. One is a purely pragmatic reason, like I was telling you, that there are, well, you can call them ecosystem services if you want to, that you get clean air, you get water from, you need all of these in the city to live, right? And you simply can't live in the city then without trees or plants or a patch that is not concrete so that water can seep into the ground. Very practical things. But I think you need nature for more than that. I think it's an imagination issue. I mean, 30% of India is already living in cities. It's going to become 50% in the next 15, 20 years. We're a youth-heavy nation, which means most of our young are growing up in cities now. And that means they're growing up in completely different environments, completely divorced of a relationship to nature. How are they going to become future conservationists, future climate activists, understand that there's a world to protect? How are you going to get mental stress relief in the city if you don't have a patch of green to look at, or a flash of color as a bird flies past you, right? So there's that whole spiritual, emotional, whatever you want to call it, psychological connect to nature, imagination of nature that I think is as important as the, you need to save the trees because they clean your air. So to me, it's just that whole gamut.
Okay, so the central theme of your current work is the commons, which are widely believed not to belong to anybody. And for a long time, I looked up Wikipedia, it said since 1833, we believe that in this philosophy of the tragedy of the commons, the idea is if it doesn't belong to anybody, then it's a free-for-all to go and rip it to pieces for one's own benefit. And this is the argument that's used to bring forest land under state control, but you have a very different perspective on this, right?
So if you look at the whole idea of, the influential Garrett Hardin paper, The Tragedy of the Commons, I think most people, when they think of commons, they think of the tragedy of the commons, as you said. It's actually not the tragedy of the commons. He talked about an English grazing patch where people would bring more and more cattle to graze because they would get more and more money and profit out of it. And then you will end up with this grassland getting degraded. In effect, that's not a commons. A commons is a place where people come together not just to use the land, but to protect the land. And they have rules about how to use it. For instance, in Nepal, this is a story that Lynn Ostrom used to tell. She went to a panchayat office, and there was this panchayat office, and it had a little patch of grazing land next to it with a cow and a fence. And they said, she asked them, this was the cow jail. What's the cow jail? So they have grazing commons, and you're not supposed to overuse the commons. And so when you have somebody's cow that is repeatedly there and should not be there, the cow goes to the cow jail. Why does the cow go? Because that panchayat office is at the center of the crossroads where everybody walks past every day and everyone knows whose cow that is. So what it does is the person whose cow is there has to pay a fine, and in the meantime, before she or he pays the fine, there's social sanctioning, right? Everybody knows your cow is in the cow jail and you broke the rules. So that's one example, but there are such creative and clever ways in which people actually police their commons or manage their commons themselves to maintain low conflict. So for instance, you look at the Sholika tribes in BR Hills. They have maintained their community forests in such an excellent way that this is the one forest area where tiger numbers have actually grown over time, right, as you've written about. And so this completely defeats our thinking that people can't manage the commons. So to me, stepping back to your point, to me, commons are the way forward. Garrett Hardin said that local people are not able to manage their own natural resources because they will be overused. They cannot control themselves from overuse. So one selfish individual will take over and destroy the entire commons. And so he suggested that governments should take over or corporate groups should take over. And we've seen that both of these have been disasters. When governments have grabbed lands from local communities, quality is often gone down because they simply can't be everywhere, and you can't police lands without local community cooperation. When corporates take over, you know that there's a profit motive involved and they will overuse because that's what they want to do. Whereas when communities own the land, they want to protect it for their children and their grandchildren because they can see this long future, right? So they will cooperate with one another. So to me, whether it's urban areas or forests, we really need, for conservation or for answering our sustainability challenges, we have to go back to cooperation, collective action, and the commons. I don't see any other way around it.
Okay, so like you said, Bangalore used to have lots of trees. It used to be called the Garden City, and now in the past couple of decades, a lot of these trees have disappeared, and you've written about lakes getting filled up. One became a bus terminus, another became a sports stadium. And if we are looking at roadside trees and public gardens and lakes as commons, then wouldn't you say that their destruction is a sign of people not taking ownership of the commons?
No, because what happened in every case is the government came and grabbed the lands from them. So if you look at all of these places, Sampangi Lake is something that Hita Unnikrishnan and I have done a lot of research on. It used to be a lake commons protected by the fishers, the grazers, the community that lived around them. But once it became, the British colonial empire came in and the Mysore kingdom was also sort of associated with it was a princely state, but managed, influenced by the British, they had to take away those rights from the people. So we have, for instance, archival documents where a number of horticulturists, so they use the land from the water from the lake for growing crops, and so as part of the commons. They write to the Mysore king saying it's not fair, you plan to drain this lake for the British regiment to play polo or to prevent the bungalows and the breweries from getting flooded. And what about us? We are your loyal subjects. But eventually that lake gets drained and the British regiment does play polo. That's one example. But if you look at Kantirva Stadium, and that's the lake that became the Kantirva Stadium. Later, the independent state of Bangalore, once it becomes Karnataka, Bangalore decides to build a stadium. So it's independent India also where the government does this. They don't understand the importance of the lake, and therefore they could have restored it by that time. It was still a large grazing open land, right? And it was used for grazing, but they took it away from the grazers and they created the sports stadium. So we have a tendency in India to think of these commons as sort of wastelands. That labeling is very interesting. If you look at a lot of government labeling of the commons, they're always called wastelands. What do you mean the wastelands? Something that's not being used economically productively, but it is economically productive. It's just that people don't see that. So all the grazing lands, all the rocky places, all the marshes, all the the mangrove areas, all of these are labeled as wastelands pretty much. Right? And so coming back to your question though, they were lost not because the communities didn't maintain them. In most cases, the communities were maintaining them, but a large apartment complex came up and started dumping sewage into that area, or the government took it over and decided to convert it into a shopping mall in the pretext of handing it over to a sports club or something like this happened. Right? So it's that they lost control, and that's the problem of a city. The municipality comes in and the municipality takes control of all the land, all the public land, and public land was actually commons land.
Okay, so if a city or municipality, I'm taking a very specific example, if they have to widen a road and they are widening roads across the board, across the country, the first thing they do is cut roadside trees. But if they be left in place because they offer all these benefits, okay, of carbon sequestration, of providing shade to pedestrians or roadside vendors, they also pose a hazard for traffic, right? So shouldn't we all as a community agree that streets are for people to move and not for planting trees?
Right. I'm glad you posed it like that. So let's break that up a bit. Firstly, when you widen streets, you don't need to cut trees, and there are some excellent examples of highways as well as roads in Bangalore, for instance, where you leave the trees as a median in the road, because anyway when you're widening it, you do need separations between lanes, and then you have a little more land that you take on the left side of the road, but you've left these trees in. What you need them for? What we've seen is they have an incredible capacity to reduce air pollution. And so purely for the health of the people moving on these roads, trees can reduce suspended particulate matter, the soot in the air, by 75%. They can reduce sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides by a dramatic 30-40%. They can reduce the heat of the asphalt surface of the road by 35-40 degrees, which means, you're getting climate change, you're getting heat islands. We are going to have a situation, let's say even 20 years from now, where most of Indian cities, at least in North India, are going to be so hot in the summer that the asphalt will melt, which means you can't use these roads, which means there's no getting away from the trees, right? You need that shade to cut it down by about 25-30 degrees to make people, I don't think they're thinking of those things. Right? And to your point about badly maintained trees being a damage, they are badly maintained, that's why they're a damage. Because what do? Somebody has a hoarding, so they chop one side of the branch, so it's lopsided, or they put concrete all around the roots, so then the tree's base is eroded. We do all kinds of things to trees. We put nails into them to hang hoardings, we wrap the branches in some kind of plastic. So we are destabilizing these trees, and we don't have a way of monitoring them every year to say, okay, here's a hazardous branch. What would they do in the US when they have trees? They monitor them every 6 months, and they say, here's a hazardous branch, we're going to lop it off, but in a way that keeps the tree still balanced. Or here's some root damage, we're going to fix it. So you don't have the situation of a tree falling on a person, for instance, or falling on a car. So I don't think we can do away with our trees on roads. We absolutely need them, and that need is going to get even more critical in the next 20 years as climate change and urban heat island effects come on us. We just have to find ways to deal with them better. And we're posing this as the either or question, right? Which is why I'm glad you posed it. We should try to figure out, how do we live with trees?
Right. Okay. So in the earlier examples you gave of how communities regulated the use of commons, how they agreed on a set of rules and everyone had to abide by them, and if they didn't, there were penalties imposed. Now in a city like Bangalore, which is cosmopolitan, it has people coming from all over the place. to live and work, and they are not necessarily of that area, who may or may not see themselves living there in the future, or their children living there in the future. So when you have a citizenry that has such low stakes in an area, how do you manage the commons then? I mean, in your lakes and your parks and your trees, whatever it be.
That's really the million-dollar question, right? What do you do in cities when you have migrants coming and then you can't have a common situation? So we were very curious about this, and a colleague of mine, Amrita Sen, and I did this work on, so there is a theory which has really been only tested in the West before, that places of the environment can serve as nodes of what you call place making. And what is place making? I come from somewhere else. This place is not my place. When does it become my place? How long does it take for me to live around Sarjapur Road and say Sarjapur Road is not my place? It is my place now and not JP Nagar where I grew up, for instance, or wherever. All of us can have examples like this. And what is the role of the environment in making that place yours? So we did this study in a number of restored lakes around Sarjapur Road, including the Kaikodali Lake, which is the lake I spoke to you about, which started me off on this journey of urban ecology research. And what we found was people of all kinds who, a whole bunch of migrants of various kinds. They could be transgender people who come, who say that they like sitting at the lake because the lake doesn't judge them. They could be parents of, let's say, kids with ADHD. They come to the lake because they say, my child, again, it's a question of judging. They say that the child runs to get excess energy away. And we go to the most secluded parts of the lake. Otherwise, people sort of tell him not to jump so much or scold him for bad behavior. And he's just letting off energy. And once he does this for half an hour, he goes to school and he's calm and happy and I'm calm and happy. Or let's say a grandfather who comes to the lake and says, there's a vapachattu, which is a neem tree in Telugu. And I grew up in Andhra Pradesh and I used to have the same vapachattu in my house. And so this tree reminds me of my house and I make connections to the lake. Or someone who came from Assam and said there were migratory birds here. The cranes reminded him of the migratory birds he saw in Assam. And so he's making the connection to the lake. So it's something, it's an incident or a landscape view or a bird or a tree or some kind of experience. They then start saying that this lake makes me come here every day. It's because of this lake I make friends. It's because of this lake that I feel calm. It's because of this lake that I feel happy. The IT workers who come with a flask of tea every day to sit there in the evening from 4 to 5 before they have to go back into their IT cave to work some more till 9 at night. And they say this is the 1 hour that keeps them sane in the day. You're not going to have that connection to a mall or a new building or whatever, an amusement arcade. You will have it to a place of nature. So what we find is places of nature really help in environment placemaking. And the next step, a number of people, not all, but a number of people that we spoke to said, now that I come here every day, I started getting concerned that there's a bit of garbage here or there's sewage coming into the lake. So I've tried to reach out to people and say, can I plant trees? Or I'm now working with my apartment to do some composting because I realize it's our garbage that ends up here. So this environmental awareness, this consciousness, it all comes in, but it has to start with the fact that this is your place. Right? So I find this very interesting. And I was talking to friends of mine also looking at urban ecology, living in parts of the US which went through a number, metropolitan US, which grew very rapidly in the 70s and 80s. And what they say is it was a very similar situation there, that you had environmental consciousness come in about 10 years later when growth stabilizes a bit. And then people stay for a bit, so it's not all migrants very transient for 5-10 years, there's this crazy growth. And then it settles down a bit, people forge connections, then you have environmental activism, then you have resident groups coming in, and then you start seeing a very different kind of civic consciousness. So I'm hopeful, maybe Indian cities are just going through this period of flux and we'll get there. We have to see.
Which makes me think, we've been through this long period of lockdown now with COVID, and if people have been boxed in their apartments or houses in Bangalore with no access to these open places, do you think the appreciation for such places has gone up?
I think yes, definitely, because you see people talking about getting back to a lake or a garden. I mean, I'm seeing, for instance, there's a group that goes to Cubbon Park regularly and posts on Facebook. and sort of the joy with which they post a photo, or the photo is received for those who haven't been able to go to the park, tells you how important that patch of nature is for them. But even for those who haven't been able to get out, I see there's a lot of terrace gardening or bird watching or butterfly watching and things like that going on, because just that little patch of color is what you're looking for to lift your spirits, really.
So one of the things that I mean, I live outside the city, so my experience of living in the city is more than 25, 30 years, where we had lots of trees in Chennai. So a lot of the trees that were planted, in my memory, I was a kid when they planted a lot of these roadside trees in the city. They were all like rain trees and gulmohars, mostly those two. And later on, I used to wonder, these are exotic trees. They don't belong here. No birds or butterflies feed on their flower, nectar, or fruits. But they are big old trees now. They are beautiful to look at. So isn't there a value in replacing these trees with native trees, so it could be a richer ecology for, not just people, but also encouraging birds to perhaps move in?
Very good question. See, I'm trying to think. At least in Bangalore, some of these trees, the rain tree, the gulmohar, you would still see a lot of birds and butterflies and insects feeding on them, because they've been around for 150 years plus, right? So in some sense, they've become naturalized. Whether the native diversity of insects or other wildlife on these trees on native trees is higher, those studies haven't been done. I suspect, as you said, they would be higher. But I think we need to balance certain things. What would come back to a place like Bangalore or Delhi or Chennai? These were largely scrubby areas, right? You wouldn't even have large trees to begin with. You'd have a lot of thorny kinds of trees. And I don't know the situation in Chennai, definitely in Bangalore and Delhi.
Well, if you are looking at Guindy National Park as an example, it won't really be scrubby. There were pretty
scrubby. They were
trees.
Okay. See, so I guess the point I'm making, and I'm speaking more from the Bangalore experience, I don't know that much about the Chennai native vegetation, is that we have modified the city so much that it's really become a novel ecological space. And now there's so much concrete that the ill effects of the heat that the concrete provides need to be factored in for wildlife and insects as much as they are for us, or the ill effects of the lights, the street lights that are there most of the night, for instance, which modify all kinds of circadian rhythms, are also need to be modified. So you can't do away to me with these kinds of spreading shade trees to some extent. Now, what would I suggest? I don't think I'd suggest cutting these large trees, because it would take about 30, 40 years for whatever native species you planted to provide the same kinds of benefits. Right? But what I would suggest is, each time they fell, then plant a native species that you could plant to replace it. Because they will fall at some point. And I think our cities are barren in so many places that we can focus on planting there. That said, again, in Bangalore, for instance, there's been this obsession about planting native species in the past 3-4 years, which means essentially we have pongemia and neem everywhere, 2 species. And that can't be good for biodiversity, right? So again, it's really an idea of the ecology that we have to look at. In Bangalore, if you would have like 50 different exotic species or just neem and pongemia, then I would go with the 50 exotic species. Now, if I had a nice rich palette of native species to choose from, of course, I would pick the native species.
Okay, I'm coming to the end of the interview. So now, I mean, you're talking about commons, dealing with people who have a stake in their use. It can get messy. Do you miss the time that you can study remote forests that you don't even step foot in from satellites?
I still do some of that. I still do it with PhD students. So, and I still do that even with cities too. I mean, I guess remote sensing is a lot of fun for me. What I do miss is the field time in the forest. I'll have to say that. Fieldwork in cities is great. I mean, I partly because I just love cities and I see them in very different ways now that I do the ecology of the city. But there's something to being in a forest that I miss terribly. So the few chances that I do get to go back to forests, often with PhD students, are really times to be treasured. And that is an experience, I mean, which is just what it is.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Harini. That was great talking to you.
Lovely to talk to you too, Jen. Okay.